She was 23 years old, pregnant with her fourth child, and she had just inherited an empire that was collapsing around her. Every major power in Europe was circling like wolves, ready to tear her inheritance to pieces. Her treasury was empty, her army was a shambles. Her own advisors doubted whether she could survive the year. And the man leading the assault, the brilliant, ruthless king of Prussia who had just stolen her richest province, was writing letters to his friends mocking her, calling her naive, predicting her imminent downfall. Maria Theresa of Austria should have been destroyed. By every calculation of power politics, by every measure of military strength, by every assessment of her impossible situation, she should have lost everything. Her empire should have been carved up among her enemies. Her dynasty should have ended. Her name should have been a footnote in history books, a cautionary tale about what happens when a young woman inherits a throne she cannot defend. Instead, she fought back for 8 years, and then for 7 more, through defeats that would have broken lesser rulers, through betrayals by supposed allies, through the deaths of children and the exhaustion of her kingdom. She fought Frederick the Great to a standstill, preserved her empire, and earned her place as one of the most remarkable monarchs in European history. This is the story of Maria Theresa versus Frederick the Great, the longest, most personal, most bitter rivalry of the 18th century. A story of stolen provinces and diplomatic revolutions, of battles that shaped continents and hatreds that never faded. A story about what happens when an idealistic young queen and a cynical military genius collide, and neither one is willing to back down. It's also a story about survival, about what it takes to endure when the entire world seems determined to destroy you, and it begins with a death. On October 20, 1740, Emperor Charles VI of Austria died unexpectedly, probably from eating poisonous mushrooms. He was 55 years old, and he had spent the last 2 decades of his life trying to solve an impossible problem. Charles had no sons. In an age when women were considered incapable of ruling, when thrones passed through male lines, when the very idea of a female sovereign was viewed with suspicion and contempt, Charles VI had only daughters. His eldest, Maria Theresa, was intelligent, capable, and by all accounts a formidable personality. But she was a woman, and in the eyes of European power politics, that made her vulnerable. Charles knew this. He had watched the chaos that erupted when the King of Spain died without a male heir. The War of Spanish Succession had killed hundreds of thousands and reshaped the continent. He was determined to prevent the same thing from happening to his own domains, so Charles created something called the Pragmatic Sanction. The Pragmatic Sanction was, essentially, a legal document declaring that the Habsburg lands could pass to a female heir and that those lands would remain undivided. Maria Theresa would inherit everything: the Archduchy of Austria, the Kingdom of Bohemia, the Kingdom of Hungary, the various Italian possessions, the scattered territories that together formed one of the greatest empires in Europe. Charles spent years getting other European powers to recognize this document. He traded territory, made concessions, gave away advantages, all to secure promises that his daughter's inheritance would be respected. France agreed, Spain agreed, Prussia agreed, Britain agreed. By the time Charles died, virtually every major power in Europe had formally accepted the Pragmatic Sanction. Those promises turned out to be worth less than the paper they were written on. The moment Charles VI stopped breathing, the calculations began. In courts across Europe, rulers and ministers looked at the situation and saw opportunity. The Habsburg monarchy was suddenly ruled by a 23-year-old woman with no military experience and no political track record. The Austrian army was underfunded and poorly led. The treasury was nearly empty. The various territories of the Habsburg realm were restive, held together more by tradition than genuine loyalty. It was, in other words, the perfect moment to strike. The first to move was the King of Prussia. Frederick II had been on the Prussian throne for barely 6 months when Charles VI died. He was 28 years old, ambitious beyond measure, and utterly unburdened by the moral scruples that constrained other monarchs. His father had left him a full treasury and one of the finest armies in Europe, a military machine that had never actually been tested in war. Frederick intended to test it now. His target was Silesia, a wealthy, populous province on the border between Austria and Prussia. Silesia had belonged to the Habsburg monarchy for centuries. It had textile industries, mineral wealth, and a strategic position that would dramatically strengthen whoever controlled it. Frederick wanted it. The excuse he manufactured was laughably thin. Frederick claimed that his family had ancient rights to certain Silesian territories, rights that had been extinguished centuries ago, and that no one had taken seriously for generations. It was a legal fiction, and everyone knew it. Frederick himself barely pretended otherwise. In private, he was remarkably candid about his motivations, ambition, glory, and the simple fact that Silesia was there for the taking. On December 16, 1740, less than 2 months after Charles VI's death, Prussian troops crossed the border into Silesia without a declaration of war. Maria Theresa received the news in Vienna. She was heavily pregnant, grieving her father, struggling to assert control over an administration that didn't quite take her seriously. And now, the King of Prussia had invaded her territory in flagrant violation of every treaty, every promise, every principle of international law. She was shocked. And then she was furious. The rage that Maria Theresa felt toward Frederick too in that moment would never fade. It would burn for the next 40 years, shaping her policies, driving her decisions, coloring her entire reign. Frederick had not merely stolen a province, he had betrayed a solemn commitment, violated her trust, and done so with the casual contempt that she found personally insulting. Other rulers would make peace with Frederick, would negotiate and compromise and move on. Maria Theresa never would. This was personal. The man who had just made himself Maria Theresa's mortal enemy was one of the most complex figures of the 18th century. Frederick II of Prussia, later called the Great, was not what anyone had expected him to become. As a young prince, he had been artistic, intellectual, more interested in French philosophy and flute playing than in military drill. He had clashed violently with his father, the brutish Frederick William I, who despised his son's refined tastes and tried to beat the culture out of him. The conflict had nearly killed him. At 18, Frederick had attempted to flee Prussia with a close friend, Hans Hermann von Katt. They were caught. Frederick William, in a rage, forced his son to watch his cat was executed, beheaded right before Frederick's eyes while the prince screamed and wept. It was an act of psychological brutality that would have broken many men. Frederick survived, but something in him hardened. The sensitive young artist became something cold, more calculating, more dangerous. He made peace with his father, submitted to the military training he had once resisted, and waited for his moment. When he took the throne in 1740, Frederick presented himself as an enlightened monarch, a philosopher king who corresponded with Voltaire, who abolished torture in ordinary criminal cases, who patronized the arts and wrote treatises on government. He was witty, charming, and genuinely brilliant. He was also utterly ruthless when it came to the pursuit of power. The invasion of Silesia revealed Frederick's true priorities. All his talk of enlightenment, of justice, of moral governance, none of it prevented him from launching an unprovoked war of conquest against a young queen who had done him no wrong. When challenged about the ethics of his action, Frederick was blunt. "I take what I want. My lawyers will find reasons afterward." This was realpolitik in its purest form. Power was its own justification. Treaties were scraps of paper. Morality was for philosophers, not for kings. Maria Theresa represented something entirely different. The young queen facing Frederick's invasion was, in many ways, his opposite. Where Frederick was cynical, Maria Theresa was deeply sincere. Where Frederick treated religion as a useful political tool, Maria Theresa was genuinely devout, sometimes to the point of intolerance. Where Frederick saw morality as a constraint to be ignored when convenient, Maria Theresa believed that rulers had genuine obligations to justice and righteousness. She was also, crucially, not prepared for this. Maria Theresa had been raised to be a wife and mother, not a sovereign. Her father had never properly prepared her for rule, perhaps because he couldn't quite believe that a woman would actually have to govern, perhaps because he hoped a male heir might still arrive, perhaps simply because he didn't know how to educate a daughter for power in a world designed for sons. When she inherited the throne, Maria Theresa knew very little about military affairs, about the complex politics of the Holy Roman Empire, about the tangled web of European diplomacy. She had to learn everything on the job, while her enemies were already at the gates. But she learned fast, and she had certain advantages that her enemies underestimated. Maria Theresa possessed a personal magnetism that inspired fierce loyalty in those around her. She was beautiful in a robust, healthy way, not the fragile beauty of a porcelain figurine, but the vitality of a woman who would eventually give birth to 16 children. She was emotionally intelligent, skilled at reading people and winning them to her cause, and she had an unshakable conviction in the justice of her position. She also had one other quality that would prove essential: she absolutely refused to give up. The first year of the war was a disaster. Prussian forces swept through Silesia with terrifying speed, overwhelming the weak Austrian garrisons and establishing control over the province before Maria Theresa could mount a meaningful defense. The Austrian army, when it finally arrived to contest the invasion, was badly commanded and poorly coordinated. On April 10, 1741, the two armies met at Malwitz in the first major battle of the conflict. The fighting was fierce and confused. At one point, Frederick himself fled the battlefield, convinced that the battle was lost. His cavalry had been routed, and the king galloped away to avoid capture. But the Prussian infantry held. The superb discipline drilled into them by Frederick's father proved decisive. Austrian cavalry charges broke against walls of musket fire. By the time the smoke cleared, the Austrian army was retreating, and Frederick, who had spent the battle miles away, could claim credit for a victory he had nearly run away from. Malwitz established Frederick's military reputation. Despite his personal cowardice in the battle, it also established something more dangerous. It proved that Austria could be beaten, and that proof triggered a feeding frenzy. Suddenly, every power that had ever coveted a piece of Habsburg territory saw its chance. France, Spain, Bavaria, Saxony, one after another. They joined the war against Maria Theresa. The Elector of Bavaria claimed the throne of the Holy Roman Empire that had been in Habsburg hands for 3 centuries, and with French support, he was crowned Emperor Charles VII in 1742. Maria Theresa was facing not just Prussia, but virtually the entire continent. Her army was losing battles. Her treasury was empty. Her supposed allies were nowhere to be found. Even her own subjects were uncertain. The Hungarians had grievances against Habsburg rule, and there was talk of rebellion rather than support. It was, by any rational assessment, hopeless. In September 1741, Maria Theresa did something extraordinary. She traveled to Pressburg, the Hungarian capital, carrying her infant son Joseph in her arms. She appeared before the Hungarian Diet, the assembly of nobles who held power in that kingdom, and made a direct personal appeal for their support. The scene that followed has become one of the most famous moments in Habsburg history, though the details have been embellished by legend over the centuries. What we know is that Maria Theresa, dressed in mourning black, spoke to the Hungarian nobles with emotional intensity about her desperate situation. She appealed to their honor, their loyalty, their pride. She acknowledged past grievances and promised future redress. The response was electric. According to tradition, the Hungarian nobles rose as one, drawing their swords and crying, "Vitam et sanguinem pro rege nostro," our life and blood for our king. The fact that they used the masculine form, king, rather than queen, was deliberate. It was a declaration that they would fight for Maria Theresa as they would fight for any male sovereign, that her sex was irrelevant to their loyalty. The Hungarian nobles voted to raise an army for their queen. Tens of thousands of troops would be mobilized, including the famous Hungarian hussars, whose cavalry would become the terror of Maria Theresa's enemies. The tide had not turned yet, but Maria Theresa had shown something crucial. She could inspire people. She could rally support through sheer force of personality, and she would not quietly accept her own destruction. The war that followed was long, bloody, and complicated. Frederick, having taken Silesia, periodically dropped out of the conflict when it suited him, making temporary peace with Austria so he could consolidate his gains while Maria Theresa fought her other enemies. Twice he did this, and twice Maria Theresa was forced to accept truces that left him in possession of her stolen province. Each time, Frederick jumped back into the war when the moment seemed advantageous, breaking his agreements with the same casual indifference he had shown when he broke his original promise to respect the pragmatic sanction. Maria Theresa grew to despise him not just as an enemy, but as a liar, a hypocrite, a man utterly without honor. She called him the monster and the evil man. In her correspondence, she referred to him with undisguised hatred. Other enemies could be negotiated with, reasoned with, ultimately reconciled. Frederick was different. Frederick was personal. Meanwhile, the war dragged on across Europe. Austrian forces fought in Germany, in Italy, in the Netherlands. French armies marched and counter-marched. The British provided money and eventually troops to support Maria Theresa, seeing France as the greater threat. Spain pursued its own Italian ambitions. Bavaria, briefly elevated to imperial status, collapsed back into Austrian occupation when Charles VII died and his son made peace. By 1745, the tide had turned in Maria Theresa's favor everywhere except against Frederick. She had survived the initial onslaught. She had rallied support. She had proven herself as a war leader. Her generals were winning battles. Her territories were largely secure. Every enemy except Prussia was ready for peace. But Silesia remained in Prussian hands. And nothing Maria Theresa could do seemed capable of changing that. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748 ended the War of Austrian Succession. It was, for Maria Theresa, a bitter document. She had held her empire together. She had defeated most of her enemies. She had proven every skeptic wrong who had said a woman couldn't rule, couldn't fight, couldn't survive in the brutal arena of 18th century power politics. But she had lost Silesia. Frederick got to keep his conquest. The richest province of her inheritance was gone, and the man who had taken it, the man who had betrayed her, lied to her, mocked her, was triumphant. Maria Theresa signed the treaty because she had no choice. Her armies were exhausted. Her treasury was empty again. Her allies were pressing for peace. She could not continue the war alone against Prussia, but she never accepted the loss of Silesia, never reconciled herself to it, never forgave Frederick. The war was over. The rivalry was just beginning. The 8 years between 1748 and 1756 were years of recovery, reform, and preparation. Maria Theresa threw herself into rebuilding her empire. She reformed the army, improving training and equipment, creating a more professional officer corps. She reorganized finances, increasing revenues and reducing corruption. She centralized administration, breaking down the patchwork of local privileges that had made Habsburg governance so inefficient. She also had more children, many more children. By 1756, she had given birth to 13, with 3 more still to come. Her marriage to Francis Stephen of Lorraine was, and usually for royal unions, a genuine love match. She adored her husband, and the steady stream of children was evidence of an active private life that Maria Theresa balanced against her demanding public role. But even amid the reforms and the nurseries, one thought never left her mind: she was going to get Silesia back. The man who would help Maria Theresa achieve her revenge was a diplomat of extraordinary cunning. Wenzel Anton von Kaunitz was not an impressive physical specimen. He was vain, hypochondriac, obsessed with his appearance, and so terrified of illness that he avoided anyone who showed the slightest sign of sickness. He powdered his face, fussed over his wigs, and conducted meetings while having his hair styled. Foreign ambassadors found him insufferable. He was also one of the most brilliant strategic minds in European history. Kaunitz had served Maria Theresa during the War of Austrian Succession, and he had drawn a crucial lesson from that conflict. Austria's traditional alliance system, the partnership with Britain and the Dutch Republic that had served the Habsburgs for decades, was broken. Britain cared about colonial rivalries with France, not about recovering Silesia. The British would never support a war to take territory back from Prussia. If Maria Theresa wanted Silesia, she needed new allies. And Kaunitz had identified the most improbable ally imaginable: France. The idea was audacious to the point of absurdity. France and Austria had been enemies for 2.5 centuries. The rivalry between Bourbon and Habsburg was the defining conflict of European politics. French armies had invaded Habsburg territory again and again. The two powers had fought on opposite sides of virtually every major war since the 1490s. But Kaunitz saw what others couldn't. The old rivalries were becoming obsolete. The real threat to Austria wasn't France, it was Prussia. Frederick had proven that he was an existential danger, a predator who would strike whenever he saw weakness. And France, too, was beginning to see Prussia as a potential threat, a rising German power that could upset the continental balance. What if Austria and France simply stopped fighting each other? What if the two great Catholic powers of Europe joined forces against the upstart Protestant kingdom that threatened them both? It was revolutionary. It would overturn 250 years of diplomatic tradition. It would shock every court in Europe. Kaunitz spent years laying the groundwork, cultivating contacts in the French court, planting seeds of possibility. And in 1756, the impossible happened. The diplomatic revolution of 1756 was, quite literally, the most dramatic realignment in European diplomatic history. Austria and France signed an alliance. The two great enemies were now partners. The news stunned the continent. Diplomats who had built their entire careers on the assumption of Franco-Austrian hostility suddenly found the ground shifting beneath their feet. The immediate trigger was Britain's decision to sign a convention with Prussia. Facing the prospect of a new war with France over colonial disputes in North America, Britain wanted to protect its Hanoverian territories in Germany. Prussia seemed like a useful partner for that purpose. Frederick, always alert to strategic advantage, agreed. But the British move gave Kaunitz exactly the leverage he needed. He could now present the French with evidence that their supposed Prussian friends were making deals with France's enemies. The betrayal, real or perceived, pushed France toward the Austrian embrace that Kaunitz had been preparing. The Franco-Austrian alliance was signed in May 1756. Russia, already hostile to Prussia, joined the coalition. Saxony and Sweden would follow. Even the Holy Roman Empire, that creaky medieval institution, would eventually declare war on Frederick. Maria Theresa had assembled the most formidable coalition in European history. France, Austria, Russia, Sweden, and most of the German states were united against a single enemy. Prussia was surrounded, outnumbered, and apparently doomed. Frederick saw what was coming. The coalition powers were building their forces, preparing for a coordinated assault in 1757. If he waited for them to strike first, he would be overwhelmed from multiple directions simultaneously. So Frederick decided not to wait. On August 29, 1756, Prussian forces invaded Saxony without a declaration of war. It was Silesia all over again. Frederick struck first, before his enemies could mobilize, gambling that speed and aggression could offset his numerical disadvantages. Within weeks, the Saxon army was trapped and forced to surrender. An entire country had been conquered in a matter of months. Frederick justified the attack by claiming, with his usual creative relationship with truth, that Austria and Saxony had been planning to attack him first. He even published what he said were secret Austrian documents proving the conspiracy. The documents may have been genuine, or they may have been forged. Either way, Frederick didn't particularly care about justification. He cared about winning. The invasion of Saxony triggered the general war that everyone had been anticipating. France, Austria, Russia, and Sweden all declared war on Prussia. The 7 Years' War had begun. Maria Theresa received the news of Frederick's attack with grim satisfaction. He had started it this time. He was the aggressor, the treaty breaker, the disturber of peace. The moral high ground was hers. Now, she just had to destroy him. On paper, the war should have been over quickly. The coalition against Frederick commanded resources that dwarfed anything Prussia could muster. France alone had 3 times Prussia's population. Russia had 5 times. Austria had twice. Add Sweden and the various German states, and Frederick was facing enemies who collectively outnumbered him by something like 10 to 1. The Prussian treasury, though substantial, couldn't possibly match the combined wealth of France, Austria, and Russia. Prussian manpower, however efficient, couldn't replace losses the way his enemies could. Every strategic calculation suggested that Frederick would be ground down through simple attrition, regardless of any tactical victories he might win. Frederick knew this. In private, he was often pessimistic about his chances, carrying poison with him in case capture became imminent. He wrote letters suggesting he expected to die in the coming conflict. But Frederick also knew something else. His enemies were a coalition, and coalitions are fragile. They have different interests, different priorities, different timelines. They argue about strategy and compete for glory. They coordinate poorly and trust each other little. Frederick's only chance was to defeat his enemies one at a time, before they could combine their overwhelming strength. He had to be fast, more aggressive, more decisive. He had to win battle after battle, and hope that eventually the coalition would fracture. It was a desperate strategy, but it was the only one he had. The year 1757 began with disaster for Frederick. He invaded Bohemia, hoping to knock Austria out of the war quickly, just as he had done in the previous conflict. His army besieged Prague, trapping a large Austrian force inside the city. Victory seemed within reach. Then came the Battle of Cologne. On June 18, 1757, Frederick attacked an Austrian army under Marshal Leopold von Daun that was marching to relieve Prague. The terrain favored the defenders. The Austrian position was strong. Frederick attacked anyway, convinced that Prussian discipline and aggression could overcome any obstacle. He was wrong. The assault failed catastrophically. Prussian infantry marched into murderous Austrian fire and was cut to pieces. Unit after unit broke and fled. By the end of the day, Frederick had lost nearly 14,000 men, over a third of his attacking force. The siege of Prague had to be abandoned. The invasion of Bohemia collapsed. Cologne was the first major battle Frederick had ever lost. Maria Theresa, receiving the news in Vienna, wept with joy. She instituted a new military honor, the Military Order of Maria Theresa, to commemorate the victory. For the first time since Silesia had been stolen, she had real hope, and Frederick's situation was about to get much worse. The summer and fall of 1757 saw Frederick's position deteriorate toward catastrophe. Russian forces invaded East Prussia from the east, defeating a Prussian army at the Battle of Gross-Gersdorf. Swedish troops moved into Pomerania from the north. A French army marched through western Germany, threatening Prussian territories from the west. Austrian forces, fresh from their victory at Cologne, pushed into Silesia from the south. Frederick was surrounded. His enemies were advancing from every direction. His army was shrinking with every battle. His treasury was draining away. By October 1757, it appeared that Prussia was on the verge of total collapse. And then Frederick pulled off one of the most remarkable military reversals in history. The Battle of Rossbach on November 5, 1757, was a masterpiece. A combined Franco-Imperial army of around 42,000 men was maneuvering to trap Frederick's force of barely 22,000. The Allied commanders were confident. They had nearly 2-to-1 superiority. They expected an easy victory. Frederick let them think exactly that. The Prussian army appeared to be retreating, pulling back from the advancing Allies. The French and Imperial commanders, eager for glory, pushed forward aggressively, trying to cut off the Prussian withdrawal. Their army spread out in a long marching column, strung out across miles of German countryside. Then Frederick struck. Hidden behind a ridge, the Prussian cavalry had been waiting. At the perfect moment, they swept around the Allied flank, crashing into the exposed marching column before the enemy could form proper battle lines. The Prussian infantry followed, slamming into the disorganized Allied forces with volleys of disciplined musket fire. The result was annihilation. The Franco-Imperial army didn't just lose, it disintegrated. 10,000 Allied soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Prussian losses were fewer than 600. The entire battle lasted about 90 minutes. Rossbach shattered the French army's reputation for a generation. It made Frederick a hero across Protestant Europe. And it proved that even when surrounded, even when outnumbered, the King of Prussia remained the most dangerous battlefield commander on the continent. But Frederick couldn't rest. While he had been dealing with the French, The Austrians had invaded Silesia. Less than a month after Rossbach, Frederick marched his exhausted army across Germany to face the Austrians. The Austrian force in Silesia, under Prince Charles of Lorraine and Marshal Daun, outnumbered Frederick's Prussians by nearly 2-1. They had taken up a strong defensive position near the village of Leuthen, confident that they could withstand any Prussian assault. On December 5, 1757, Frederick attacked them anyway. The Battle of Leuthen is considered one of the most brilliant tactical victories in military history. Frederick used terrain and his famous oblique order to concentrate overwhelming force against a portion of the Austrian line while the rest of the enemy army couldn't intervene. He marched his troops behind low hills, invisible to Austrian observers, and struck the Austrian left flank before the defenders fully understood what was happening. The result was even more devastating than Rossbach. The Austrian army was rolled up from the flank, regiment after regiment crumbling as the Prussian assault swept down their lines. By nightfall, the Austrians had lost 22,000 men, over a third of their army. Frederick lost just over 6,000. Silesia was saved. Frederick had snatched survival from the jaws of destruction. In Vienna, Maria Theresa received the news of Leuthen with bitter fury. Another army shattered, another commander disgraced, another year of sacrifice wasted. But she refused to despair. She still had France. She still had Russia. She still had resources that Frederick couldn't match. The monster could not win every battle. Eventually, mathematics would prevail. The war would continue. The years that followed were an exhausting war of attrition, punctuated by moments of spectacular violence. Frederick won battles and lost battles. His army shrank as irreplaceable veterans fell in combat. His generals were killed or captured. His treasury was empty, and he resorted to debasing his currency, issuing coins with reduced precious metal content to pay his troops and suppliers. The famous Prussian efficiency began to crack under the unrelenting pressure. In 1758, Frederick fought the Russians at the horrific Battle of Zorndorf. It was less a battle than mutual slaughter, both sides attacking with savage fury, neither willing to retreat. Thousands of men dying in close quarters combat that contemporary observers described as more butchery than warfare. Both armies were wrecked. Frederick claimed victory because he held the field, but he had lost over 12,000 men he couldn't replace. Later that year, Austrian forces surprised Frederick at Hochkirch, attacking his camp before dawn and nearly capturing the king himself. Frederick escaped, but he lost over 9,000 men, including some of his best generals. Another blow to an army that couldn't afford many more. And still Maria Theresa pressed on. She had learned to be patient. She had learned that Frederick could be beaten not through any single stroke, but through relentless, grinding pressure. Her armies might lose battles, but they would keep coming. Her treasury might strain, but French and Russian subsidies would help. She would not stop. The year 1759 brought Frederick to the brink of annihilation. On August 12, a combined Austro-Russian army met Frederick's Prussians at Kunersdorf in what would become the bloodiest battle of the entire war. Frederick attacked with his usual aggression, initially driving back the Russian positions. But the Allied forces held their center, and a crushing counterattack swept into the Prussian flanks. Frederick's army didn't just break, it shattered. Nearly 19,000 Prussian soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Frederick himself had 2 horses shot out from under him and barely escaped the field. The Prussian army, as a coherent fighting force, temporarily ceased to exist. Frederick wrote to his minister, "I have no more resources, and to tell the truth, I believe all is lost." He seriously contemplated suicide, seeing no path to survival. The road to Berlin lay open. Austria and Russia could march on the Prussian capital and dictate whatever terms they wished. This should have been the moment of Maria Theresa's final triumph. This should have been when Frederick's career and Frederick's kingdom ended, but the blow never fell. The coalition that Maria Theresa had so carefully assembled began to fracture at the moment of its greatest success. The Austrian and Russian commanders couldn't agree on what to do next. The Russians were exhausted, far from their supply lines, unwilling to advance further into German territory. The Austrians wanted to pursue the advantage, but couldn't do it alone. Precious weeks slipped away as the Allies argued and delayed. Frederick, given time he didn't deserve, began to rebuild. Somehow, he scraped together reinforcements. Somehow, he reorganized his shattered forces. By the time the Austrians and Russians finally coordinated their next move, Frederick had an army again battered, smaller, but still capable of fighting. The opportunity was lost. Maria Theresa was furious with her Russian allies, whom she blamed for failing to press the advantage. But there was nothing she could do. Coalition warfare meant coalition politics, and coalition politics meant compromise, delay, and missed opportunities. Frederick survived. Again, the war dragged on for 3 more agonizing years. Frederick continued to fight, though with diminishing resources and mounting desperation. He won battles at Liegnitz and Torgau in 1760, proving that the Prussian army was still dangerous. But each victory came at a cost he couldn't sustain. His kingdom was being bled dry. His people were starving. His army was increasingly filled with pressed men and prisoners of war forced into Prussian service. Maria Theresa kept her coalition together through sheer diplomatic effort. French commitment wavered as the war in North America went badly and French finances collapsed. Russian commitment depended on the continuing hostility of Empress Elizabeth toward Frederick. Swedish participation was minimal and ineffective, but the Austrians kept fighting. Maria Theresa poured resources into her army, reformed and reformed again, learning from each defeat. Austrian forces captured major Prussian positions. Austrian cavalry improved dramatically. Austrian generals became more capable. By 1762, Prussia was genuinely on the verge of collapse. Frederick had perhaps 60,000 men to face enemies who together could field 3 times that number. His treasury was gone. His people were exhausted. One more campaign season might be enough to finish him. And then, on January 5, 1762, Empress Elizabeth of Russia died. The death of Elizabeth was, for Frederick, a miracle. Her successor was Peter a man who was, remarkably, a passionate admirer of Frederick the Great. Peter worshipped Prussian military methods. He kept portraits of Frederick in his rooms. He had been devastated by the war against his hero. Within weeks of taking the throne, Peter pulled Russia out of the war. Not only did he make peace with Prussia, he actually offered Frederick an alliance. The Russian troops who had been fighting alongside Austria suddenly switched sides. It was one of the most dramatic reversals in military history. Frederick, on the verge of destruction, was suddenly reprieved by the death of a single person. Maria Theresa was stunned. Her coalition had been torn apart by pure chance, by the random timing of an empress's death, by the random personality of her successor. All her diplomatic work, all Konitz's careful construction, all the blood spent over 7 years undone by factors entirely beyond her control. Peter III would be overthrown and murdered just months later, replaced by his wife, Catherine the Great. But Catherine, though she withdrew from the Prussian alliance, had no interest in resuming the war. Russia was done. Without Russia, the coalition couldn't win. France was exhausted and seeking peace. Sweden had already withdrawn. Austria stood alone against a Prussia that, while weakened, was no longer surrounded. Maria Theresa had to face reality. She could continue the war alone and risk losing everything, including territories beyond Silesia, or she could make peace and preserve what she had. She chose peace. The Treaty of Hubertusburg, signed on February 15, 1763, ended the 7 Years' War. Its terms were brutally simple. Everything went back to the way it had been before the war started. Frederick kept Silesia. After 7 years of warfare, after hundreds of thousands of deaths, after the expenditure of treasure that would take generations to recover, nothing had changed. The borders were exactly where they had been in 1756. For Maria Theresa, it was the bitterest possible outcome. She had built the greatest coalition in European history. She had fought for 7 years with determination that awed even her enemies. She had come within a hairsbreadth of total victory, and she had nothing to show for it. Silesia remained Prussian. Frederick remained on his throne. The monster had survived. When Maria Theresa signed the treaty, she reportedly wept, not tears of relief that the war was over, but tears of frustration and rage at the injustice of the outcome. She had done everything right. She had assembled overwhelming force. She had persevered when others would have surrendered, and still she had lost. Frederick, by contrast, was exultant, though he hid it behind a mask of philosophical detachment. He had faced the combined might of most of Europe and emerged intact. His kingdom was devastated, his army a shadow of its former self, his treasury empty. But he had Silesia. He had his throne. He had proven that Prussia could survive anything. The rivalry between Maria Theresa and Frederick would continue for another 2 decades. But it would never again take the form of open warfare. Both rulers were too exhausted, too drained, too aware of the costs. The hatred remained, the competition remained, but the fighting stopped. What followed was something more subtle, and in its own way, more fascinating. The decades after 1763 saw both rulers throw themselves into the work of reconstruction and reform. Frederick returned to a Prussia that had been bled nearly to death. The male population had been decimated. Villages stood empty. Fields lay fallow. The famous Prussian efficiency had been replaced by desperate improvisation. Some historians estimate that Prussia lost nearly 500,000 people during the 7 Years' War, an almost inconceivable toll for a kingdom of barely 4 million. Frederick's response was characteristically energetic. He imported colonists to repopulate empty regions. He invested in agriculture, introducing new crops and techniques. He rebuilt the army, though more modestly than before. He reformed the legal system, continued his patronage of the arts, and corresponded with philosophers across Europe. But something had changed in Frederick. The confident young king who had invaded Silesia with such careless ambition was gone. In his place was an older, harder, more cynical man. He had seen too much death, made too many desperate gambles, come too close to destruction. The wit remained, but there was a coldness behind it now. Frederick increasingly withdrew from human connection. His marriage had always been loveless, a political arrangement that produced no children and no affection. He surrounded himself with dogs rather than people, finding in animals a loyalty he trusted more than any human relationship. He became more autocratic, more isolated, more convinced that he alone knew what was best for Prussia. His famous flute remained, and he continued to compose music. But those who heard him play noted a melancholy that hadn't been there before. The philosopher king had looked into the abyss, and something had looked back. Maria Theresa's post-war years were marked by a different kind of transformation. Where Frederick withdrew into cold isolation, Maria Theresa expanded her emotional world. Her children, 16 in total, became increasingly central to her political calculations. The great dynasties of Europe were, after all, family businesses, and Maria Theresa intended to place her children on every available throne. The most famous of these dynastic placements was her youngest daughter, Maria Antonia, known to history as Marie Antoinette. In 1770, at the age of 14, Marie Antoinette was married to the heir to the French throne, cementing the alliance that Kaunitz had built and symbolizing the new era of Franco-Austrian cooperation. Maria Theresa worried about her daughter constantly, writing letters filled with advice, warnings, and maternal anxiety. She sensed that Marie Antoinette was not prepared for the treacherous waters of the French court. She was right to worry, though she would not live to see the ultimate tragedy. But the children were also a source of profound grief. Maria Theresa lost several to smallpox and other diseases, devastating blows that she mourned with an intensity that sometimes alarmed her advisors. When her beloved husband Francis died suddenly in 1765, she was shattered. She wore mourning black for the rest of her life, had Francis's rooms preserved exactly as he had left them, and visited his tomb regularly to pray. Her grief was genuine, but it coexisted with continued political ruthlessness. Maria Theresa remained the ruler of a great empire, and she never forgot that fact. The relationship between Maria Theresa and Frederick in these later years was a strange mixture of continued hostility and grudging respect. They never met in person. They never reconciled. Maria Theresa continued to refer to Frederick in the harshest terms, and Frederick continued to make cutting remarks about the Austrian queen in his correspondence with Voltaire and other intellectuals. But they also watched each other with a kind of wary fascination. Each recognized in the other a worthy adversary. Each understood that the other represented something fundamentally different about how to rule, and yet each had proven capable of surviving challenges that would have destroyed lesser monarchs. Frederick admired Maria Theresa's determination, even as he mocked her piety and conservatism. Maria Theresa recognized Frederick's military genius, even as she despised his atheism and amorality. They were enemies who had defined each other's reigns, antagonists who had brought out both the best and worst in each other. In 1772, this strange relationship took its most ironic turn. The first partition of Poland was, in many ways, the logical conclusion of 18th-century power politics, and also its moral nadir. Poland, the great kingdom that lay between Prussia, Austria, and Russia, had been weakening for decades. Its political system was dysfunctional, its military was inadequate, and its neighbors were circling. Frederick had long advocated for simply carving up Polish territory among the three Eastern powers. By 1772, circumstances aligned to make this possible. Russia had become entangled in a war with the Ottoman Empire, and Frederick proposed the partition as a way to satisfy all parties. Russia would get Polish territory instead of Ottoman, Austria would receive compensation for staying neutral, and Prussia would gain the territories Frederick had long coveted. Maria Theresa was horrified. The partition of Poland violated every principle she claimed to hold dear. It was naked aggression against an innocent country. It was the strong devouring the weak. It was exactly what Frederick had done to her with Silesia, except now she was being invited to participate in the crime. Her letters from this period reveal genuine moral anguish. She called the partition a violation of everything that was holy and just. She agonized over the precedent it set. She worried about divine punishment for such blatant injustice. And then she took her share anyway. Maria Theresa acquired Galicia, a substantial piece of Polish territory that significantly expanded Austrian power. She wept while signing the partition treaty, reportedly saying, "She weeps, but she takes." Frederick, ever the cynic, mocked her mercilessly. She wept, but she took. And the more she wept, the more she took. It was a devastating indictment, and it stung precisely because it was true. Maria Theresa had spent decades presenting herself as the moral alternative to Frederick's ruthless realpolitik, and at the crucial moment, when faced with the choice between principle and profit, she had chosen profit. Some historians have tried to excuse her, arguing that she had no choice, that Austria would have been disadvantaged if Prussia and Russia partitioned Poland without Austrian participation. Others have pointed out that her son Joseph, now co-ruler, pushed strongly for the partition and might have proceeded without her consent. But Maria Theresa herself offered no excuses. She knew what she had done. She knew it was wrong, and she did it anyway. Perhaps that makes her more human. Perhaps it makes her a hypocrite. Perhaps it simply makes her a ruler, someone who, when principle and power collided, ultimately chose power. Frederick would have understood perfectly. The final years of both monarchs saw them wrestling with questions of legacy and succession. Frederick, childless by choice and temperament, worried constantly about what would happen to Prussia after his death. His heir was his nephew, Frederick William, a man he regarded with barely concealed contempt. The nephew was religious where Frederick was skeptical, sentimental where Frederick was cold, conventional where Frederick was brilliant. Frederick spent his final years trying to systematize his rule, writing political testaments that would guide his successors, creating institutions that could function without his personal genius. He knew that Prussia's survival had depended on his individual abilities, and he feared what would happen when those abilities were gone. He also grew increasingly pessimistic about human nature and the future of his kingdom. The confident optimism of his youth, the Enlightenment faith in progress and reason, had been beaten out of him by decades of war and court intrigue. In his final writings, Frederick presents a dark vision of politics as an endless struggle for survival, of states as predators who must eat or be eaten, It was a philosophy he had lived, but living had cost him something essential. Maria Theresa's final years were marked by conflict with her own son, Joseph I, who had been co-ruler since Francis's death in 1765, was an impatient reformer who chafed under his mother's conservatism. He wanted to move faster, push harder, transform the Habsburg lands into a modern, rationalized state. He had little patience for tradition, religion, or the careful diplomacy that Maria Theresa favored. Mother and son clashed constantly. Joseph wanted religious toleration. Maria Theresa was deeply Catholic and suspicious of Protestants and Jews. Joseph wanted to abolish serfdom. Maria Theresa worried about social stability. Joseph wanted aggressive expansion. Maria Theresa had learned the costs of war too well. Their letters reveal a relationship of genuine love mixed with profound frustration. Maria Theresa adored her son, but couldn't control him. Joseph respected his mother, but couldn't wait for her to step aside. They were bound together by blood and duty, but separated by generation and temperament. As Maria Theresa aged, her health deteriorated. She grew enormously stout, struggled to breathe, and suffered from the various ailments that accumulated over a life of constant childbearing and relentless stress. She knew the end was coming. On November 29, 1780, Maria Theresa died in Vienna. She was 63 years old. She had ruled for 40 years, survived challenges that should have destroyed her, raised an enormous family, and shaped the destiny of Central Europe. Her death was the end of an era. Joseph, too, finally free to rule alone, immediately began implementing the radical reforms he had long advocated. Many of those reforms would fail, and Joseph himself would die just 10 years later, exhausted and disillusioned. But that's another story. Frederick outlived his great rival by 6 years. He received the news of Maria Theresa's death with characteristic ambivalence. They had been enemies for 40 years. She had tried to destroy him, and he had done everything in his power to humiliate her. And yet, somehow, her death affected him. In the years that followed, Frederick sometimes spoke of Maria Theresa with the respect he had rarely shown while she lived. He acknowledged her courage, her determination, her political skill. He recognized that she had been a worthy opponent, perhaps the worthiest he had ever faced. Frederick's own final years were marked by declining health and deepening isolation. He suffered from gout, asthma, and various other ailments. He rarely left his palace at Sans Souci, preferring the company of his dogs to that of humans. He continued to work obsessively, managing the details of Prussian administration until he could no longer hold a pen. On August 17, 1786, Frederick the Great died. He was 74 years old. He had ruled Prussia for 46 years and transformed it from a minor German state into a great European power. He was buried, according to his wishes, beside his beloved dogs. So what do we make of this rivalry? What lessons does it offer? The conflict between Maria Theresa and Frederick the Great was, on one level, simply a territorial dispute. Frederick wanted Silesia. Maria Theresa wanted it back. They fought 2 devastating wars over this single province, killed hundreds of thousands of people, and exhausted their respective kingdoms. And in the end, Frederick kept Silesia. The status quo of 1745 was. The status quo of 1763 was the status quo of 1780. All that death, all that destruction, and the map looked essentially the same. But that's too simple a reading. The wars between Maria Theresa and Frederick established something far more important than any territorial boundary. They established Prussia as a great power, a player that could compete with Austria, France, and Russia. They demonstrated that the European balance of power could no longer ignore this upstart German kingdom. They set the stage for the eventual unification of Germany under Prussian leadership nearly a century later, and they transformed both rulers in ways that shaped their entire reigns. Maria Theresa entered the conflict as an untested young woman, dismissed by her enemies as weak and temporary. She emerged as one of the most formidable monarchs in European history, a survivor, a reformer, a mother of emperors and queens. The challenges Frederick threw at her forced her to become stronger, smarter, more capable than she might otherwise have been. Frederick entered the conflict as a brilliant young king with everything to prove. He emerged as a legend, but also as a haunted, isolated figure who had seen too much death and trusted too few people. His victories came at a personal cost that's difficult to measure. The rivalry also illuminates something fundamental about leadership and power. Frederick represented one vision of rule: cynical, calculating, brilliant, and bound by moral constraints. He saw the world as it was a brutal competition for survival, and he played that game better than almost anyone. His Prussia was efficient, effective, and utterly ruthless. Maria Theresa represented a different vision: traditional, religious, rooted in a sense of moral obligation that she genuinely felt, even when she violated it. She saw herself as responsible not just for power but for justice, not just for the state, but for the souls of her subjects. Her Austria was messier, less efficient, but perhaps more human. Neither vision was entirely right. Neither was entirely wrong. Both rulers achieved remarkable things and committed terrible acts. Both left legacies that shaped the modern world. Perhaps the most honest conclusion is that they needed each other. The rivalry between them brought out capacities that might otherwise have remained dormant. Without Frederick's invasion, would Maria Theresa have discovered the steel within herself? Without Maria Theresa's implacable opposition, would Frederick have been tested to the limits of his genius? They were enemies who defined each other, antagonists who, in their struggle, revealed what they were truly capable of becoming. In the end, both of them were fighting for survival. Maria Theresa for the survival of her inheritance, her dynasty, her vision of a just Catholic order. Frederick for the survival of his kingdom, his achievements, his place in history. Both succeeded. Both failed. Both left the world transformed. Maria Theresa died knowing that her empire would continue, that her children sat on thrones across Europe, that she had preserved the Habsburg legacy against all odds. She also died knowing that she had never recovered Silesia, never defeated the monster who had tormented her for 40 years. Frederick died knowing that Prussia was secure, that his life's work would endure, that history would remember him as one of the great captains of the age. He also died knowing that he had no children, no close friends, no one who truly loved him, just the dogs that slept at his feet. Two visions of power, two definitions of success, two rulers who spent their lives locked in a struggle neither could definitively win. The teenager who invaded Silesia in 1740 could not have imagined where that decision would lead. The young queen who swore vengeance could not have known what that vengeance would cost, but perhaps that's the nature of great rivalries. They begin with a single act, a broken promise, a stolen province, an unforgivable insult, and they grow into something that consumes entire lives. Maria Theresa and Frederick the Great hated each other for 40 years. They fought each other, schemed against each other, defined themselves against each other. They never reconciled, never forgave, never forgot. And in their hatred, they shaped the world. Some enmities are personal. Some enmities are political. The enmity between Maria Theresa and Frederick the Great was both and more. It was a collision of values, a clash of civilizations, a war for the soul of Europe fought through armies and diplomacy and sheer, stubborn will. Neither of them won. Neither of them lost. They simply endured, year after year, battle after battle, until death finally ended what neither of them could. The war for survival lasted a lifetime, and in surviving, both of them became immortal.